did you know that most variability in portfolio returns comes from the asset class mix, not the individual investments themselves? And that is why when we're constructing a portfolio, it matters so much to understand the different types of investments, including their risks and returns. There's often a mismatch between what portfolio will generate investors the best return and what portfolio they can actually stomach, because investing sounds very different in theory than it feels in real life. A 20% market fall, when we read about it in the news article, is all happy days. But when that 20% fall happens to our actual portfolio, whether that's your retirement savings, your business sale proceeds, or the money you're going to go for a nice holiday with in Barbados with the wife and kids next year, that suddenly feels a lot tougher. When we're building a long-term investment strategy, we're thinking less about what portfolio is going to generate the investor the absolute best returns, and we're thinking more about what portfolio is going to allow them to keep making good decisions consistently over the long term. You're effectively looking for your portfolio life partner, someone that you can stick with for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. So let's walk through the 4 main investment types, starting with the lowest risk but the lowest return. The first asset class is cash. Now, I like cash. I feel like cash has had a bit of an unfair reputation recently. Inflation has definitely reminded us that having a large sum of cash sitting in your current account probably isn't the pinnacle of sophisticated wealth management, shock horror, but cash certainly does have a role. In fact, cash has several important roles. You should be holding cash for your day-to-day spending, your emergency reserves, and your short-term spending needs. If you're holding cash for any other reason, you might need to check yourself. But cash has a behavioural role as well as a practical role. We often find that cash gives investors a sense of security. It's like your warm little hug, and that's okay. That can often be underestimated. For affluent individuals especially, they're not holding their cash because they think it's going to make them their next million. They're holding it because it gives them a sense of security. It makes them feel like they have control. And feeling secure matters, particularly during times of uncertainty. It can help to have some liquidity to make us feel a little safer and give us that warm hug. But don't let comfort become inertia. We sometimes meet people that are still holding a very large cash sum years after a business sale or after a large inheritance because they're waiting to feel ready. But let's have a reality check. I'm still waiting to feel ready to run a marathon and waiting to feel ready to apply to be the next Prime Minister. You're rarely going to feel fully ready. You've got to stop thinking that the markets are going to come up to you and whisper in your ear, telling you that they're ready for it. And this financial procrastination is important because cash loses its purchasing power after inflation gets to it. For the past 30 years, the average return from cash has been 2.8% a year. And once we factor in inflation, that is only 0.4% every year. And for quite a large amount of time in that 30-year period, the return from cash was negative after inflation. Your money was literally washing down the drain if you were holding it in cash. So, whilst cash reduces short-term volatility and its liquidity gives us that warm hug, it can be a silent assassin if you're holding large sums for too long in your portfolio. So, if cash isn't the best security blanket, then let's take a look at our next asset class, which still gives us that slight bit of stability in our portfolio, but takes on slightly more risk, often meaning we can expect slightly better returns than cash. Fixed income, bonds, debts, it goes by many names, but we're all familiar with it. Okay, so they don't sound as exciting as tech stocks or private equity. If you're on a date and you whisper to your partner, tell me more about your gilt allocation, your date's not going well. Bonds aren't sexy. But bonds play a hugely important role in our portfolios. Essentially, with bonds, you're lending money to government or companies in exchange for interest payments. And historically, bonds have been able to produce slightly higher returns than cash by carrying a little bit more risk, but they are still generally less volatile than equities. Now, they're not sexy, but they are a nice stabilizing force to have in your portfolio when the equity markets are making us feel a little hot under the collar. Bonds help to smooth an investment journey, which is particularly important for investors entering retirement or drawing income from their portfolio. And that smoothing matters because the biggest risk for many investors isn't volatility itself, it's abandoning their plan as soon as things get hot under the collar. Abandoning the plan as soon as you hit the first bit of volatility is basically like your pilot jumping out of the plane as soon as he hits a bit of turbulence, and he's only gone and taken the only parachute. So if you're in an allocation that is meant to be generating you high returns, but it makes you feel a bit twitchy, then it might not be the right portfolio for you. And bonds can be a fantastic way to help put the stabilizers back on. And there's no shame there. Sometimes we all like cycling with the stabilizers on. Okay, drum roll please. It is time for the big boy. Equities. Shares in companies. This is where most returns in a portfolio are going to come from. Equities have historically produced the highest returns long term of all the major asset classes. In fact, when we tried to make a chart showing the above inflation growth of a £1 investment made in 1900, we had to put equities on a scale 100 times larger than the other asset classes. When we're talking real money after inflation, £1 invested in 1900 in cash would be worth £3.50 today. If you invested that in bonds, it would be worth £13.86. If you invested in alternatives, you'd be looking somewhere in between, which we'll get onto later. But most importantly, £1 invested in 1900 in equities would be worth a whopping £1.1 thousand after inflation today. Now, we don't all have a 126-year investment horizon unless we're considering intergenerational wealth planning. But even when we look decade by decade since 1900, equities have beat the other asset classes in real returns 8 out of the 12 decades. It's a card you want to play if you're investing long term, and I emphasize a long term because there is a price you have to pay for investing in equities, and that is volatility. Markets can change, sometimes quite a lot. Now, the reasons that markets can fall can sometimes feel completely rational and can sometimes feel quite ridiculous. For example, COVID-19, a global pandemic, markets fell. Fair enough, we'll let them off. However, do you remember the 2010 flash crash caused by the Hound of Hounslow, who was investing very large sums into the US stock market and then pulling out at the last minute, contributing to a $1 trillion crash in US stocks? Pretty awkward. Even experienced investors can feel discomfort at times of great market volatility, but the difference is an experienced investor understands that volatility does not necessarily mean a plan is broken and needs to be abandoned. They are not the pilot that jumps out of the plane. Put it this way, volatility can be seen as the admission price for the long-term return roller coaster. But experienced investors, they grew up going to Alton Towers. They can stomach it. They're in for the ride. One of the most dangerous things we see investors do is build a portfolio purely based on returns expectations without considering their emotional tolerance or whether they have a stomach for the roller coaster. Obviously, it's easy to tolerate risk when the markets are up 15%, but it's far less easy when news is suggesting that civilization is going to end around lunchtime, which can be once a week, depending on which news article you read. This is why asset allocation becomes deeply personal. Two people with identical wealth can require completely different portfolios, not because one is better at investing than the other, but because their lives are different. One will have a different investment horizon, a different attitude to risk, different objectives that they're working towards. And finally, before we move on to our last asset class, let me be clear, there are lots of different ways to invest in equities, and they do not all generate the same results. Now, it's a conversation for another day, but put it this way, I'm still looking for the magical stock picker fairy that lives somewhere in a rainbow castle in Mayfair and gets it right every time, but I haven't found him yet. Okay, buckle up because it's time to talk about alternative investments. Now, have we all had an alternative phase? I feel like I avoided my alternative phase in school. I never went emo, but I did dye my hair pink once, so I don't know if that counts. Alternative investments are a broad category. They're things like property, commodities, infrastructure. Their investments are outside the traditional stocks and bonds market. If you thought that equity stocks sounded sexy, then alternatives sound very sexy, and the media absolutely loves them. They get a lot of attention that should sometimes be treated with some skepticism. Now, I like to imagine two different types of alternative investors. First of all, let's take Ian. He loves crypto. He's that friend that tells you about crypto and how well he's doing. He thinks he's found the next best thing in crypto, and he wants to sell all his organs on the black market to be able to invest fully in that cryptocurrency. And then let's take Steve. Steve has a fine art collection. It's worth a few bob, and he gets emotional value from looking at it every day. My partner Tom's a good example of a Steve type investor. He's got every Star Wars Lego minifigure to ever be made, and if you're wondering, that's about 1,200. And he's not holding it because he thinks cash is going to be dead and we're all going to have to trade in Lego Star Wars figures. He's holding it because it makes him feel happy. And that's okay to an extent when it's in my own house, but that can be okay if it gives emotional value. So what are the benefits of alternatives? They could definitely provide some diversification, but do not mistake them as being a sophisticated product. Just because they're more complex doesn't mean that they're any better than the good old stocks and bonds market. Now, in my view, alternatives do absolutely have a role in some portfolios, but I would only really consider them for larger portfolios. We're talking £1 million plus, and that is because of the trade-offs involved with investing in alternatives. Higher costs, reduced liquidity, and more complexity. It's very rare that retail investors can get wealthy off of investing in alternatives, especially if it was your friend Ian who told you about them, or you found it on ChatGPT. If you're looking to invest in alternatives, you need to make sure you're working with a top financial advisor. I think we're hearing more about alternatives because in recent times, traditional markets have felt a little bit more uncomfortable. But just because you can't see the prices live updating every day in your banking app does not mean that alternatives are a calmer investment. Do not mistake invisible volatility for no volatility. Ultimately, whether having some allocation in alternatives is right for you is going to be a balance of behavioral and mathematical. But if your goal is long-term returns, personally, I would stick to the good stuff in the traditional market. So to wrap this up, hopefully we've shown that constructing a portfolio isn't about trying to find the best returns. It's about trying to choose the investments that are going to be right for you. Your investments need to match your goals, your lifestyle, your timeline. They need to match how strong your stomach is on a roller coaster. For somebody investing across multiple generations, equities may dominate. Whereas for someone retiring in 3 years and looking to draw an income, stability is going to matter far more. There is no universally correct approach or generic standard financial advice that can be given. And this is why some of the financial commentary you see online can be quite misleading, especially if it's trying to tell you about a sexy ETF or a particular new cryptocurrency to be interested in. A portfolio isn't successful because it generated the highest possible returns. A portfolio becomes successful if it gives the investor the greatest probability of achieving their long-term goals. Those two are not always the same thing. Some of the most successful investors we meet are not the ones that are constantly checking their phone every day, worried about whether their stocks are up or down. They're the people with clear objectives, clear time horizons, and a clear understanding of their asset features. Successful investors design their portfolio around their real life rather than theoretical perfection. Investing isn't a competition. You're not going to get a prize for tolerating the maximum volatility. Your goal should be to build a structure that's going to allow you to grow wealth and to sleep well at night. But luckily for you, it's that balance that often generates the best returns long term anyway.